Hello and welcome to this edition of BM Talks with me, Helen Thomas, CEO and founder of Blonde Money. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Harriett Baldwin, Conservative MP for West Worcestershire since 2010. She is currently Shadow Minister for Business and Trade, previously has been Economic Secretary to the Treasury, amongst many other roles in Parliament, including Chair of the Treasury Select Committee, which she still sits on that committee today. And prior to this career in Parliament, she worked for JP Morgan. She was head of currency management at JP Morgan Investment Management. So at this time, with business, trade, and economics absolutely crucial to the world economy, I can think of no better person to speak to. Hello, Harriett.
Hello, Helen.
Right. Well, kicking off on that point, given your varied experience there, particularly as Economic Secretary to the Treasury, how would you be assessing the current fiscal risk facing the UK, particularly in light of recent global developments, the challenges on inflation, and all this disruption to trade? How do you assess the situation right now fiscally for the UK?
Yeah, I think we're in a challenging situation fiscally, and that's really because after the pandemic and with Putin's evil invasion of Ukraine, we had two enormous events that put enormous fiscal pressure on the UK government, would have put enormous fiscal pressure on any UK government of any stripe, and indeed put a lot of pressure on governments around the world. And in the case of the UK, the pandemic alone added about £400 billion to our deficit. And then, of course, we had the inflation spike, which sadly became, quite protracted and long.
Mm.
And we're still suffering, I think, from some of those inflationary pressures in the UK today. And so, as a combination of those two things, we had a general election last year. We had a new government come in, and they inherited a situation where the fiscal debt, the amount that we had borrowed as a country, was very close to our entire GDP.
Mm.
And instead of saying, well, look, things are difficult. There's a lot of pressure on the public finances, and but we've committed to growth in this country, and therefore we won't be raising taxes and we won't be increasing borrowing. They actually brought in a budget, a Halloween budget, at the end of last year, which it added something like 350 billion pounds, so like another whole pandemic of borrowing onto our numbers over the life of this parliament, and that's made the UK considerably more vulnerable to where we are today, which is obviously a rising interest rate environment around the world, lots of governments competing to issue government debt, and it makes it very, very precarious for the UK economy.
Absolutely. A good summary there of where we find ourselves today. It's quite eyebrow raising when you put it in contrast, that amount of borrowing over the pandemic and then what the government obviously announced last year. Um, Speaking then of the fiscal rules and I mean, why Rachel Reeves went down the path she did, but um, look, there's this rule about debt falling as a share of GDP in 5 years, somewhat similar, although not entirely the same, as to what the Conservative government had been looking at. There were adjustments there. You might like to mention what they were, but um, does that rule still command credibility in the markets? It looks at the moment as if it's a bit wobbly. What do you think on that, and could the rules be changed?
Well, first of all, I would make the political point that in the general election campaign, Rachel Reeves committed not to changing the fiscal rules. And then, of course, lo and behold, she did change them, and she made them a lot looser. Secondly, the other thing that she promised was that she wouldn't raise taxes other than the ones that they'd outlined, the one on school fees in particular, and that she wouldn't raise the main rates of tax, and that she would focus on getting expecting the UK economy to grow.
Mm.
But then, despite those promises to the electorate, at the first budget, there was the most enormous increase in taxation, something like almost 1% of the economy in terms of tax increases on businesses as well. So they've had the exact opposite of growing the economy. They've actually contracted payroll employment quite sharply, and they've made her job so much harder. And no one really, from the point of view of the British public, the voting public, can really see the benefits at all at this stage. So it's just been all pain and no gain. And I think that's put her in a very difficult political position going into this next budget, because obviously it looks as though she's going to have to come back, despite her much looser fiscal rules, for another round of tax increases. And it's extremely concerning that we've now got over 2 months to speculate on what those tax hikes will be.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's just it feels like there's another policy leaked every day on that front in terms of what the kite's being flown as to what this next budget will include. Now, I mean, what would what would you do differently though? Because we talked about how this is a really challenging situation, has been since the pandemic, if not before, in terms of getting growth. And of course, people would say, well, your party was in power for 14 years. Taxes did rise, certainly latterly. Is there any one or two headline policies that you would like to see that you think could get growth going?
Yeah, no, thank you. We certainly had the same pressures in terms of the cost of COVID and the cost of the invasion of Ukraine and the energy price impact. But what we'd started to do with Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister and Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor was they had actually started to be able to reduce the levels of personal taxation. So there was 2 rounds of cuts in terms of national insurance paid by employees, which put more, genuinely put more money into people's pockets.
Mm,
And there was a way to fund that through being able to tackle the welfare budgets. It's one of the things that really hasn't happened since the COVID pandemic is that the welfare budget has ballooned so
mm,
much. There are so many additional claims for sickness benefits in the UK. It's absolutely unsustainable. And the time of COVID, obviously, we moved away from the face-to-face assessments of these conditions, and it became much easier to claim without going in and actually seeing someone. And so that hasn't yet been reversed. That's something we certainly think should be reversed. And indeed, in the general election campaign, we set out some £12 billion worth of things like that we thought would not the welfare budget, but slow the growth in the welfare
mm,
budget so that it became less unsustainable than it's currently on track to be. Very sadly, at the beginning of this year, the government suddenly realised that they needed to do the same thing.
mm.
They put together some proposals which were roundly rejected by their backbenchers, but I think they will have to do that again. So we're going to continue to offer to work with them
Mm.
to stop the growth in the welfare budget being as extreme as is currently projected by the Office for Budget Responsibility.
Yes, it's quite remarkable in the recent reshuffle. Pat McFadden has got this bigger brief now on work, pensions, and skills, which all seems to be designed towards, making a more productive workforce, which is commendable if it can get done. We will see. Other reforms that you've looked at yourself latterly have been on pensions, something you've known a lot about. You've looked at reforms to the pension system. Do you have any recommendations now to help address long-term demographic challenges in the UK economy? The OBR in their fiscal risk sustainability report over the summer spent quite a lot of time talking about the pensions industry, and they specifically had been looking at demand for gilts in the long end of the bond market because of changes in the pensions landscape. So, do you have anything you're looking at personally there on the pensions side of things?
Yeah, there is there's pensions legislation currently going through Parliament, and I think to some extent what Rachel Reeves has done in terms of financial services and pensions generally is pick up on some of the reforms that have been going through under the previous government and emphasise those in her rhetoric. I think there are some things in the pensions reform that the government have put forward that make a lot of sense, but I think there are some perhaps uh, issues I don't feel very comfortable about, and I declare an interest as a trustee of the Parliamentary Pension Fund.
Mm.
I don't think that we need anything in legislation that cuts across our fiduciary duty to get the best possible returns to secure the payments of our pensioners of the future. So I think that it's an area where currently we're seeing a big improvement in terms of pensioners' incomes. This is thanks to the triple lock that's now been in place for over a decade in the UK. That is raising pensioners' incomes. I think that we're very proud of that and the impact that's had on pensioner poverty. But it has been effectively funded by raising the state pension age for the majority of the population here in the UK. And I think that the current government has set up something to look overall at pensions,
Mm.
build on the success of the auto enrolment rollout, which has got more people saving more for their retirement. And I think there's still more that we can do in that space as well. So it needs to evolve. It needs to reflect changing demographics, as you say, and it also needs to make sure that pensions, which often can take some of the longer term risks in the economy, fund some of the infrastructure that we have a requirement for. It has to be encouraged to do that, and I think there's some progress being made currently in legislation for that.
Well, you prior to being an MP, as we mentioned there, worked in the investment management industry, so have had a long period of time looking and thinking about how people do save for their retirement. And I think the reason I wanted to get you on to my podcast is, we have people who listen who are interested in politics, they're interested in markets, how they interact. And you are uniquely positioned as an MP who has had experience as a fund manager investing in global markets. So, do you think, on gilts specifically, do you think the UK retains a gilt edged safe haven status, or is that being eroded now, do you think?
Well, look, I don't think anyone who holds a gilt should worry about it being repaid.
Mm.
So obviously, I think from that point of view, people shouldn't be concerned. But I think there are other reasons why people should be concerned, and that's specifically to do with the fact that we're obviously out of the very low interest rate era, and people had got used to those very, very low interest rates. And, they are gone forever. We've normalized interest rates now in this
Mm.
country. And I, as you mentioned, being extremely long in the tooth, can remember back in 1994 when I was a fixed income bond manager, and the bond markets just melted down that year. Interest
Mm.
rates went up by 3, 4, 5%. It was an enormous increase in interest rates. And I've always felt that that was a real risk in terms of government borrowing, not just for the UK, but for lots of countries around the world. They've been borrowing at these much lower interest rates than normal. And just by normalising, it's going to cost a lot more. As the Office for Budget Responsibility said, every 1%, I mean, it's simple maths, isn't it? When you've got a 100%
Mm.
deficit and interest rates go up 1%, that adds another 1% to your cost of servicing that debt. And that really makes it much more challenging to try and bring the deficit under control. So it's a very worrying situation. The potential with so many governments having so much borrowing
Mm.
the potential for things to go very badly wrong and has to have a really bad bear market for bonds is
Mm.
high. And we've seen a couple of phases of that, haven't we, in
Yeah.
the last year or so. So I think that continues to be a big risk. It's a very big risk when you've got a deficit as big as ours. And it's something that is very worrying. The other thing on top of that, as if that weren't bad enough, is you've got the Bank of England reducing its enormous holdings of gilts, which had got up to something like 845 billion.
Mm.
They've got a stated aim of bringing that down to probably about half that size. And they're the only central bank in the world that's actively selling gilts into a market that is occasionally finding things fairly hard going. So I think that's an additional risk for gilt investors to be following closely, and I'm sure they are. But certainly for my constituents who maybe own a gilt, they shouldn't worry. It will be repaid,
Mm.
and it's not that big of
Mm.
a crisis that you won't actually even get your money back. You will get your money back with gilts.
Thinking of that, talking about the 90s, there's been quite a lot of discussion now about index linked debt, which actually the UK issued a lot more index linked debt in the 1980s and into the 90s, and it's left us with a far bigger proportion of our debt being linked to inflation. Now, there's a bit of a debate about this, whether it's a good or bad thing. It's growing at the moment that people think this is a bad thing, which again, it's sort of mathematics, as you said. If you've got debt that you're protecting against inflation, inflation comes back, then you are going to pay more to protect the investors on that. But I was told that, look, that debt came in the 80s as actually supposed to be a kind of fiscal discipline. It was supposed to act to force policymakers to avoid that outcome. It was sort of a way of trying to embed into the system that it would bear down on inflation. You wouldn't let it get out of control. So I just wondered, with your experience, and you talk about savers, and there's a lot of people who find the UK's index linked debt to be attractive, whether you have a view one way or the other as to whether index linked gilts are kind of a good or a bad thing, or if they're, should we issue less of them? Should the debt management office be making decisions on this?
Yeah, so the way the process works is that every year the debt management office will come up with an estimate of how much they're going to have to issue that year. And they'll come in with a proposal that we think we should do a blend of this, that, and the other. And if they feel there's particularly strong demand for index-linked gilts, they'll suggest that be included in the mix. And so then the economic secretary of the time will look at that and sign off on that, or go back and say, well, actually, have you thought about this? But realistically, the experts are the debt management office. They know where the demand is, and there was clearly a significant segment that demanded. I beg your pardon, I've got a bit of a cold. Demanded index-linked gilts, and they were being sold at a price that was relatively attractive.
Yeah.
And so we're left with this large stock of index-linked gilts, large compared to other countries. And we've just experienced a horrible inflation surge. So, that is another thing that is not good for the public finances. And it was an inflation surge that clearly the bank had to move on eventually,
Mm.
and certainly something that is costing the taxpayer and is scheduled to cost the taxpayer, I think, over a further 80 billion in the Office for Budget Responsibility numbers. So it's painful.
Mm.
But the question about the judgment of what mix of gilts
Mm.
you should do is up to the debt management office. But the debt management office has also been given a very difficult job by governments, and particularly by this government after last year,
Mm.
by them increasing the amount of issuance that they need to do by such a substantial amount. And so there are some very large and very indigestible amounts of gilts that are having to be issued every year now by the debt management office, and that's before the Bank of England sells off its own holdings. So it's a tricky time, I think, for the gilt markets. These are large numbers, and we've seen one or two moments where they've suffered from a bit of indigestion.
Yes, and you talk about the Bank of England there, and I know you've you've had many members of the Bank of England in front of you at the Treasury Select Committee, both when you were chair and again more recently. I mean, obviously they come regularly as part of their oversight of what the Bank of England does. I mean, do you think that the bank has, well, do you think the bank could have done more over the last few years, both on bearing down on that inflation surge and on, as you say now, with quantitative tightening, uh, potentially pulling back a bit from that reduction in the balance sheet? I mean, I tend to find that your interventions on this, you've been, I would say, sort of a critical friend to the bank. Is there something is there something when you get them in front of you next time that you'd really want to talk to them about?
Well, I certainly think there are some things with the benefit of hindsight that they themselves would acknowledge have not worked as well as they should. And I think a lot of people think that that last tranche of it was another 150 billion of gilts that they bought over the pandemic, was a lot.
Mm,
And probably went on for longer than it needed to. And they now have this enormous balance sheet, which, I do agree they have to bring their balance sheet down. And so then it becomes a question of whether they do that by actively selling into the market and which ones they sell, or whether or not they just let them mature like some other central banks have chosen to do. I think where I've tried to probe is if you take as your assumption that quantitative easing was designed to make the markets easier and to relax credit, then
mm,
surely you've got to think that quantitative tightening is doing the opposite of that.
mm,
But they are very reluctant to acknowledge that it's anything other than a technical activity. The most they would agree to say it would mean in terms of tightness of the economy is that it was perhaps a 25 basis point tighter than otherwise. And
yeah.
I think that we don't know on a forward-looking basis, but I think has got to be logical that has the potential to tighten things quite a lot, not just directly, but also because of the impact it has on the government's fiscal position over time.
Mm,
So there's an ongoing debate about that. There are people in the political domain who are saying that it should be handled completely differently, that there are ways for the government to save money for the taxpayer.
mm,
The governor's told us very clearly in a letter that he sees that as quote unquote illusory. It's
mm.
an area I'm going to continue to probe.
Good. Well, I want to ask you about the Treasury Select Committee because it's a extremely important and influential committee. I remember in the financial crisis, there are a lot of very important testimonies that were given by many of the architects of the issues of the banking crash came in front of the Treasury Select Committee, and over the years, there's been many other points at which big there's been people coming in front of this Treasury Select Committee where they've been held to account. The Treasury Select Committee has an important role for doing exactly that. And in this sort of day and age where people maybe feel that politics isn't working and what can you do, and they all we shrug our shoulders and everyone gets angry on social media. Select committees, it's not just the Treasury Select Committee, but select committees in Parliament do have a really important role to play. But do you think that the Treasury Select Committee should have more authority to interrogate or even constrain fiscal policy? Could it be part of the oversight function, much in the way we have the OBR? Is there more that could be done, I suppose, given that, as we've said at the beginning of this discussion, there's a lot of challenges on the fiscal position, and the Treasury Select Committee kind of sits there with backbench MPs and perhaps is more free to challenge some of what politicians are doing. What do you think?
That's a great question, and we are considered influential, and we can influence things. Of course, we can. I know you have extremely erudite listeners, but just in case they're not aware, the chair role of the Treasury Select Committee is one that a government of the day will always want to have for their party, and the makeup of the Treasury Committee will always reflect the proportion of MPs in the House of Commons. So at the moment, the Treasury Committee is obviously a Labour chair.
Mm.
The vast majority of MPs on the committee are Labour, and there are only two of the 11 are Conservative, and only two of the 11 are Liberal Democrat, and there are no other parties represented. So it's going to be very much a government dominated committee, and that, in a way, can make I'm not saying that it's the case at all with this committee, but just bear in mind that there is that flavour to it in terms of any government of the day is going to want to have the majority on an important committee like that, and that's what the rules set
Mm.
out. But yes, we can be very influential. We have the power to summon witnesses as well. That's one of the powers that
Mm.
we have. One of the witnesses that I tried to get, though, over the years, I never agreed to come, was the IMF. They're
Oh.
very pleased to say things publicly on the record on their tweets, but they were never prepared to come and actually sit in front of the Treasury Select Committee. The best I was able to do when I was chair was to get them to come and give us evidence in private.
Ah.
So I find that very frustrating, given that the UK pays a large sub to the IMF. I think they are accountable to the British taxpayer, and they ought to come and be prepared to have questions asked of them and their assumptions, just like the Office for Budget Responsibility or any other think tank might do, and certainly the bank does.
I think that's really quite surprising, I have to say. I don't know if that's their policy and then maybe they're not appearing in front of any committees in
It's
any
their
government.
policy. So they've
Ah,
got so many members, they have
yeah.
140 member countries. They feel that if their economists were required to be accountable to Parliament. But having said that,
Mm.
we had them in the UK for an Article 4
Mm.
visit, and we were very keen to have them come and give us evidence. And the only thing they were prepared to do was to come and see us in private. So that probably took about as much time as seeing us in public would have done. But there
Well,
we
and
are.
as you say, Harriet, about their the contribution of certain countries into the IMF. I mean, yes, there are 140 countries, but how many of them, if you took the budget of the IMF, what proportion is contributed by, let's say, the top 10? I mean, I would
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
quite a significant amount. So you could imagine that they could make the case that they might do that. That really
Yeah.
is fascinating. I mean, I always interested in those Article 4 consultations. I mean, I note that one of the more recent ones the IMF did, they talked about welfare reforms, and they were welcoming the government's welfare reforms in terms of a path towards debt sustainability, which of course actually never got passed
No.
in the form they were announced. So, actually, I think if the IMF are going to be making judgments on the policy of the country, the
They're
more.
always very happy to make a sweeping commentary, from in their press sessions, but not actually prepared to come and meet with MPs. And the other thing that when we did meet them in private, we asked them was, well, you're over here for your Article 4 visit. Who have you actually met with? And it
Mm,
was all the sort of London-based think tanks. It was the Treasury officials. It was the Bank of England.
mm.
And so I said to them, well, did you go outside London at all? Chipping Barnet was as far as they got. So
Wow.
no,
Okay.
they literally had not left London. So I think they could do more, it seems to me, to fully understand the UK economy.
Goodness me, that talk about, yes, an unbalanced look at the British economy. We talk about the levelling up
Yeah,
and the focus on
yeah,
the southeast. That's quite
yeah,
specific. But
yeah.
look,
They're
I haven't got
running
too.
around by tube. Yeah,
Yeah, well, gosh, at the moment, that's not even possible, is it? Given thanks to yet more strikes. I only have you for a couple more minutes, and thank you so much for talking around all of this. If I might end on I suppose, a personal note, if I may. I mean, you've been an MP since 2010. you lost a lot of colleagues at the last election. Parliament must feel quite different now. This is your first time as fully in opposition as an MP. I mean, how does it feel in Parliament? I just want to get a sort of flavour. I mean, you mentioned about obviously Labour won such a huge number of seats that there's a natural mathematical domination in various committees. That's just the rules. That's how it works. But how are you finding life as an opposition MP in Parliament? Are there there are upsides, more flexibility, but are there also downsides? What's it actually like in Parliament now?
Well, as you say, I'm back as a member of His Majesty's Loyal Opposition this time, and I think that, we have a really serious job to do. We are constitutionally responsible for scrutinising and holding the government of the day to account. And because it's only 121 of us, it's incredibly hard work. I've never worked this hard in my in my 15 years as an MP. It is flat out. There are not very many of us. There's great team spirit, and we are finding lots of things to oppose.
Yeah, I suppose that's right. And you have business and trade, don't you, as your brief, Harriet? So I mean, keeping on top of all those Trump tariffs, let alone everything else. I mean, how are you finding that role specifically in business and trade? What's your focus at the moment? What are you looking at?
Yeah, so business and trade, obviously, we scrutinise what the government's doing in terms of those trade deals, and we obviously want to make sure that the UK, in terms of the US trade state visit next week, that there's progress because we have actually gone backwards under this government with our trade with the US because tariffs are higher than they were beforehand. I know we did relatively okay compared to other countries, but still we are in a worse off position. We think there's room for improvement in other trade relationships as well. And so we continue to pressure the government on that. And they have delivered some good progress in terms of India. And we're looking to see the details of that. So we want to scrutinise that closely. So that's an important part of what we're doing as His Majesty's Loyal Opposition.
Very good. Right. Well, I'll leave you to get back to that important work. And I really do appreciate your time and for slotting us in from your office in Parliament, as, if I may just say, quite a lot going on right
Yes,
now
yes.
in Westminster.
Yes, absolutely.
And we're
And
breaking for
um,
conference soon. I mean, actually, the Conservative conference is late this year. It's the last one, isn't it? Um,
yeah, 5th to the 8th of October, Manchester.
yeah, it's going to be very busy. Well, look, thank you so much, Dame Harriet Baldwin, for your time. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We love your feedback. Please do send it on to me if there's anything you'd like to say. helen@blondemoney.co.uk, or you find me on social media. Thank you again, Harriet, for your time.
Bye.